A house by the sea, a storm that never quite passed, and a legacy built on silence. Some truths don't come screaming. They whisper year after year until someone finally listens. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The sea had a way of speaking at Ravenhill, low and mournful, like the last lines of a forgotten poem. Jessica Fletcher stood at the crest of the long gravel drive, the manor rising before her like a relic out of time. Gabled and ivy-covered, its stones bore the weight of generations. The Atlantic wind carried the scent of salt and something older, mildew, perhaps, or secrets. She adjusted the strap of her overnight bag and offered a wry smile to the driver. "Thank you," she said gently. "I'll manage from here." Inside, the foyer opened like the first page of an old novel, candle sconces, dark-panelled walls, and a silence that felt measured. A tall man emerged from a side corridor, impeccably dressed, his demeanour crisp and almost theatrical. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, inclining his head. "I'm Simon Trent, Mr. Hawthorne's secretary. Welcome to Ravenhill Manor." Jessica returned the greeting with quiet warmth. "It's kind of Mr. Hawthorne to host this retreat. I've long admired his work." Simon's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll find the manor steeped in literary tradition." As he led her upstairs, Jessica noted a tapestry fraying at the corner, a water ring on the banister's dark wood. Small things, neglect that had crept in like dust, quietly accumulating. At the door to her guest room, Simon hesitated. "There are few rules here, Mrs. Fletcher," he said. "But one, Mr. Hawthorne values his solitude. Best not to disturb him unannounced." Jessica nodded politely, but mentally tucked the remark away. A rule, that specific, often came with a reason. And in houses like this, solitude was rarely what it seemed. The sitting room on the second floor was arranged like an afterthought. Chintz armchairs, a low fire struggling against the draught, and a tea service gone cold. Jessica arrived to find the others already gathered, voices quiet, eyes flicking. Lydia Vale was the first to speak. Her voice, once known for lyrical phrasing and emotional precision, now rasped like wind through reeds. "Jessica Fletcher," she said with a sideways smile, "I thought they only invited the living legends." Jessica demurred politely, though Lydia's words were edged with something brittle. She wore a scarf, not for fashion, but concealment, and her eyes, rimmed with fatigue, watched everything. Edwin Crowley barely looked up from his copy of the Times literary supplement. His handshake was limp, his glance uninterested. "Another writer among writers," he muttered, not quite under his breath. Then came Miles Hanley, younger than the others, with a novelist's restless energy. "I grew up reading your books," he said, offering Jessica a sincere smile. Not many writers can craft a mystery without condescension. Before Jessica could reply, the final guest entered. Camilla Hawthorne, with her father's eyes and an air of displacement. Her return from Europe, Jessica had heard, was recent and uncelebrated. The atmosphere was courteous but laced with tension. As Jessica observed their exchanges, she felt it, something stale in the air like old rivalries not yet buried. Each of them had come to Ravenhill for something. Not all of it, she suspected, had to do with writing. Dinner was served in the manor's formal dining room, where the candelabras fought against the encroaching dark. Jessica sat across from Lydia and adjacent to Miles, both of whom avoided Edwin's gaze. Theodore Hawthorne, the host, remained conspicuously absent. "I find it curious," Lydia remarked, lifting her glass with a trembling hand, "that one would invite guests and then not appear." Simon, ever composed, responded from the head of the table. "Mr. Hawthorne prefers to dine alone. His health demands quiet." Camilla scoffed softly, her fork pausing mid-air. His health? Or his pride? Jessica noted the flicker that passed through Simon's eyes. The air shifted with the weight of unspoken histories. "I imagine," Edwin drawled, "that none of us came for the wine." Miles set down his glass. Some of us came for the truth, and perhaps a bit of justice. An awkward silence settled, broken only by the clink of porcelain and the steady tapping of rain against the windows. Jessica didn't speak. She watched. Camilla's feigned detachment, Lydia's tightened fingers around her napkin, Simon's careful neutrality, and Miles, whose idealism had a dangerous glint to it. Jessica had been to many dinners, but this one had the feel of a final act rehearsed behind smiling masks, a performance not yet complete, but closing in. Later, in the upstairs corridor, Jessica paused by the library doors. A faint sound like a drawer sliding, then silence. When she turned the handle, the room was empty, but the lamp on the desk was still warm. She returned to the hallway and descended slowly. The house had a way of breathing, its age creaking softly underfoot. As she passed the parlour, she glimpsed Agnes, the housekeeper, scrubbing at an already clean sideboard. Her movements were harsh, almost anxious. "Long evening," Jessica offered gently. Agnes looked up, startled. "Storm coming in," she said. "This house don't like storms." Jessica nodded. "And Mr. Hawthorne?" Agnes's eyes darted toward the upper floor. "Locked in, same as always. Keeps his door shut, and his ghost's closer." The phrasing lingered with Jessica as she made her way back to her room. There was something about Ravenhill that was neither quite alive nor at rest, like a story that had ended badly, yet never been told. The storm arrived in the early hours, rattling the window panes and groaning through the chimney flue. Jessica, restless from an indistinct unease, rose and reached for the shawl draped over the chair. Ravenhill was quieter than usual, as though the very stones held their breath. She padded down the hallway and found herself at Theodore's study. The door, surprisingly, was ajar. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the embers of a dying fire. Papers were scattered across the desk, but what caught Jessica's eye was the inkwell, ceramic and blue, shattered across the floor. Its contents had spilled like blood across a page. Carefully, she stepped closer. Among the stained papers was a single sheet, warped and wet with ink, but legible in part. "Do not trust." The sentence stopped mid-line. No signature, no context. Jessica crouched beside the desk. The ink was still fresh. Someone had been here recently. She examined the pieces of the broken inkwell. The break was jagged, but one edge was clean, as if forced rather than dropped. A soft footstep behind her made her turn, but the hall was empty. She returned to her room shortly after, unsettled. The message haunted her more than its ambiguity. It felt like a warning left too late. And as she lay awake, listening to the storm batter the manor, Jessica Fletcher couldn't shake the feeling that something had already happened. Something that ink could no longer hold back. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a heavy silence. Jessica rose early, her sleep fragmented by restless thoughts and the lingering image of ink pooled across parchment. The manor felt different now, emptier somehow, as though something essential had slipped quietly away in the night. She was halfway down the main staircase when she heard Simon Trent's voice, strained, tight with something held in check. "I found him," he said to Agnes, who stood pale near the foot of the stairs. "Just now, in the library." Jessica's breath caught. She descended the remaining steps, her hands steady, her mind suddenly alert. The library door stood ajar once again. This time, the chill within came not from the hearth, but from the presence of death. Theodore Hawthorne lay slumped beside his writing desk, one arm hanging limp, the other resting atop a closed book. A glass sat on the desk, beside a half-empty decanter of whiskey. Scattered near his feet, a bottle of sleeping pills. Jessica remained still, taking in the scene without speaking. There was something too calm about it all, not peaceful, constructed. "Simon," she said gently, "has anyone called the police?" He turned to her slowly, his composure crumbling, just enough to reveal the cracks. "The phone lines are still down." Agnes, hands clenched in her apron, whispered, I told him the house doesn't like storms. Jessica looked at Theodore's face, calm, composed, untouched by fear or pain. A man like him would not have gone quietly. Not without a struggle, not without a word. She stepped back, her thoughts already gathering themselves like pages in a draft. Something here wasn't right. Not the body, not the arrangement, and certainly not the silence it left behind. Jessica waited until the others had arrived, drawn one by one to the news like moths to a dark flame, before she quietly approached the desk once more. Her eyes moved slowly across the items, the glass, the pills, the closed book. All staged, she thought. But by whose hand? The glass was clean. Too clean, not a smudge, not even condensation. The pills were scattered in a loose arc, unnatural in their placement, like someone trying to imply chaos without understanding it. And the book beneath Theodore's hand, Meditations on Authorship, was one she remembered seeing in the upstairs sitting room the night before. So why was it here now? Jessica bent slightly, noting the pillow on the nearby armchair, creased, used. Theodore had likely been here long before the scene was staged, but someone had returned after. Simon hovered near the fireplace, wringing his hands behind his back. He was under great pressure, he offered quietly. He hadn't been well. Did he speak of death? Jessica asked. Simon hesitated. Not directly, but his tone. It had shifted. Jessica nodded, filing the phrase away. People often remembered tones. They were less reliable with facts. Miles Hanley stepped into the room, eyes sweeping the body, then the desk. This doesn't feel like him, he said under his breath. Jessica said nothing aloud, but inwardly she agreed. The scene bore the shape of grief, but not its substance. Something had been performed here, and if she could read the props closely enough, perhaps she would find the author. Jessica remained behind as the others trickled out in heavy silence. With Simon's reluctant consent, she approached the desk once more, this time sliding open the top drawer. Amidst the usual jumble, stationery, pens, and an old fountain pen with a cracked cap, lay a photograph. She drew it out carefully. The image was in black and white, worn soft at the edges. A group of 6, young writers by the look of them, stood clustered around a table piled with manuscripts and coffee cups. Their faces radiated promise, enthusiasm, hunger. One of them she recognized faintly, Lydia Vale, younger, healthier, a wistful smile instead of her current guarded grimace. But the photograph had been torn, cleanly and recently. The missing portion had removed a 7th face, the jagged edge cutting just beyond a visible shoulder. Jessica ran her finger along the edge. Not accidental. Someone had wanted this image incomplete. She turned it over. A date, faded by time. October 1979. No names. A faint mark, a smudge of fresh ink, lingered near the torn edge. Perhaps the page she'd found last night had once lain nearby. Jessica slipped the photograph into her notebook and glanced once more at the drawer. At the very back, half buried beneath receipts and aged envelopes, was a folded napkin with the initials E.C. scrawled in the corner. Coffee-stained, faintly perfumed. Was it a clue or merely sentiment? She couldn't yet say, but in Ravenhill the past didn't sleep. It only lingered, waiting to speak when the silence got loud enough. The parlour, when Jessica rejoined the others, had turned sombre. No one filled the silence. The fire had gone out and no one moved to relight it. Lydia sat apart from the group, her gaze unfixed, her teacup untouched. Jessica took a quiet seat near her, watching as Edwin Crowley leafed through a dog-eared notebook, unconcerned or perhaps detached. Camilla stood by the window, arms crossed tightly, face half hidden in shadow. Miles paced, restless, driven, and when he finally spoke, it was not a eulogy. "This wasn't suicide," he said. "Theodore may have been cruel, but he didn't surrender, not like this." Edwin looked up slowly. "Grief makes everyone a playwright, Mr. Hanley, but not all of us write believable fiction." "Some of us," Miles retorted. "Were silenced before we even started." Jessica noted the remark and Edwin's lack of reaction. She turned her attention back to Lydia. "You were close to him once, weren't you?" A long pause, then, "Once. A lifetime ago, but not recently." Her voice was faint, distant. Jessica studied her hands, trembling but not from emotion. Illness, perhaps? Fatigue? Or both? "I didn't see him last night," Lydia added, unprompted. "I went to bed early." Jessica's mind caught on the detail. No one had asked where she'd been, yet she had answered a question not spoken aloud. A reflex born of guilt or fear? She folded that uncertainty away, placing it alongside the others. Pieces of a puzzle, still waiting for their edges to align. Later that afternoon, while the others retreated to their rooms or wandered the manor's colder corners, Jessica returned to the library. Alone this time. The air still held the faint scent of cedar and paper, a room meant for ideas, now steeped in finality. She studied the desk again, but her eye drifted to the far bookshelf, the one closest to the fireplace. Something tugged at her attention, a subtle detail. The bookshelf sat just off from the wall, only slightly, an inch at most. She stepped closer. A fine scratch marked the polished floorboards beneath it, almost lost in the grain. Jessica crouched, fingers brushing lightly along the floor. The shelf had been moved recently. Not fully, but enough to disturb it. A gap ran along the right side, slim but deliberate. She pressed her fingers to the side panel. It gave a little, resisting at first, then relenting with a soft creak. The shelf slid back just enough to reveal a narrow cavity behind. It was empty, or perhaps it had been emptied. Jessica stood, her mind alight with quiet hypotheses. Why move a shelf only partially? Why leave the mechanism half concealed? If something had been hidden there, manuscripts, letters, evidence, someone had already taken it, or meant for someone else to find it. And yet they hadn't covered their tracks completely. She stared at the narrow gap a moment longer, then closed it with care. Whatever secrets had lived behind that shelf, someone believed they were still worth hiding. And Jessica Fletcher now had one more thing to find. Jessica lingered in the library a moment longer before retreating to the hall, the hush of the storm pressing against the leaded windows like a warning. Outside, the skies remained pewter grey. Inside, Ravenhill had settled into the kind of silence that did not comfort, it measured. The guests dispersed after the coroner's assistant, delayed by the washed-out road, left with the promise of a formal report once the weather cleared. In the meantime, Theodore's body had been moved to a small drawing room, respectfully veiled in linen. Jessica had insisted it remain untouched otherwise. She found herself once more in the second-floor sitting room, watching the hearth struggle to light. The firewood was damp, slow to catch, much like the mood of the house. Simon sat in a corner chair, writing something in a small leather-bound ledger. Camilla had not come down. Miles was pacing again, too close to the windows. Lydia stared into the flames, her hands folded, unmoving. Jessica took her tea without sugar and listened, more to what was not said than what was. She had learned over the years that grief often revealed character, and sometimes guilt. As Miles muttered something about manuscripts being stolen, and Lydia clutched at her scarf, Jessica noted how Simon flinched at a question no one asked aloud. The storm outside may have trapped them, but it was the storm inside, the glances, the bitterness, the buried past, that truly held them prisoner. And Jessica knew this mystery had far deeper roots than anyone wished to admit. Late that morning, Jessica found herself in Theodore's study once more, this time with Simon, who seemed more hesitant than usual. She had asked gently about the will, careful not to press, but curious enough to stir something in him. He hesitated near the locked drawer of the desk, then gave in with a resigned sigh. "Mr. Hawthorne made revisions just 2 days ago," he said, unlocking it with a small brass key. "He insisted on privacy. I was only to act as witness." Jessica took the document from him with care. The signatures were clear, the names precise. The estate, once intended for Camilla, was now to be left in trust for a literary foundation, named for Lydia Vale. Jessica looked up. Was Miss Vale aware? I don't believe so, Simon replied. She hadn't spoken with him in years, but he said it was time to make amends. Jessica read the rest silently. It was thorough, almost impersonal, save for the last line. For voices once silenced, may this foundation offer space to speak again. A noble sentiment, perhaps, or an attempt at redemption. But why exclude Camilla entirely? Jessica closed the folder, her expression unreadable. That's a significant change. Simon offered a weak smile. Everything about Mr. Hawthorne was significant. As she returned the will to its drawer, Jessica's thoughts turned. Lydia had motive now, at least on paper, but that also made the gesture suspicious. Too neat, too public. Someone had orchestrated this shift. The question remained, who benefited most by making Lydia appear to? The afternoon grew darker as the storm resumed its slow assault on the coastline. Jessica found Agnes in the dining room, folding linens with tight, efficient hands. The housekeeper's eyes darted up at Jessica's approach, then back down, as if to pretend she hadn't noticed. "May I trouble you for a moment?" Jessica asked, her voice gentle. Agnes hesitated, then set the linen aside. "Yes, ma'am?" Jessica considered her carefully. "You've served Mr. Hawthorne a long time." "Since Camilla was a child?" "Then you knew his habits, his moods?" Agnes nodded, eyes lowering again. He kept things to himself mostly, but storms made him restless. Jessica leaned against the sideboard. "Did you hear anything unusual last night?" A pause. "I shouldn't say." "You overheard something, didn't you?" Agnes swallowed hard. "I was coming down the back stair, wanted to close the shutters. I heard him in the library. He wasn't alone." Jessica said nothing, waiting. "A man's voice," Agnes whispered. "Younger than Mr. Hawthorne. Angry. They were arguing about something stolen or owed. I couldn't make it all out." "Did you recognize the voice?" Agnes shook her head. "It didn't last long. Then the door slammed. Quiet after that?" Jessica placed a hand on the woman's forearm. "Thank you." Agnes nodded, eyes clouded with something more than memory. Fear, perhaps. Jessica turned away, the fire of quiet deduction stirring again. A younger man, a confrontation, a closed door. The question wasn't just who had visited Theodore last night. It was who had left, unseen but not unheard. The library remained Jessica's compass, its quiet, its texture, its subtle disorder. She returned again in the late afternoon, the rain tapping the windows like an impatient editor. She retraced her earlier steps, pausing now near Theodore's high-backed chair. Something white caught her eye near the base, almost lost in the dark carpet. She bent to pick it up. An ivory chess piece, pawn. Scuffed slightly at the base, it bore the distinct patina of touch, not display. Jessica turned it over, thinking. The library's chess set had sat dormant on a side table since her arrival. She'd noted it in passing, pristine and polished, its pieces arranged for a game never played. Earlier that day, Simon had been dusting them, his movements slow, even reverent. But now one piece was missing. Why? Had someone taken it as a token, dropped it unknowingly, or used it to gesture at something deeper? Jessica replaced the piece silently, her mind racing through patterns. Chess was about strategy, about knowing your opponent's weaknesses. But pawns, she knew, could be sacrificed, moved first, seen as least. Who had played their move first last night? And who had counted on no one noticing such a small white ghost beside the chair? Sometimes the quietest objects spoke loudest. Jessica had begun to listen. That evening, with the wind howling through the rafters, Jessica found Lydia alone in the upstairs sitting room, staring out toward the sea. The fire had gone out. Her cup of tea, untouched, had gone cold. "I never asked," Jessica said softly. "How well you knew Theodore." Lydia did not turn. "Once I knew him as well as anyone could, or thought I did." "You were more than colleagues." A pause. "Yes." Lydia looked older in the half-light, the lines on her face more map than mask. "He published your early works." "And refused to publish my last. Called it indulgent." Her voice caught. "He was right in a way, but it was also honest." Jessica sat beside her, watching her hands. No rings, no tremble now. "He said it would ruin my legacy," Lydia continued. "So I let him. And then I watched as he lifted others instead, some less talented, some indebted." Jessica's thoughts turned. "Do you know Miles Hanley?" Lydia smiled faintly. "He reminds me of someone we once knew, eager, sharp, but easily bruised." Jessica let that linger. "What did Theodore owe you, Lydia?" "Nothing," she whispered. "And everything." Jessica didn't press further. Some griefs weren't linear. Some histories couldn't be folded cleanly. But what Lydia left unsaid was louder than her words. And somewhere in the silence, Jessica heard the sound of a door, closed long ago, finally shifting on its hinges. Later that night, Jessica passed through the drawing room on her way to her guest quarters. The fire had burned low, casting more shadow than light. As she crossed near the hearth, something brittle crunched faintly beneath her slipper. She crouched, careful, and lifted what looked like a charred scrap of paper from the fireplace grate. It flaked at the edges, but a few words remained, scorched but legible. "Truth comes at cost. Some cannot bear to pay it, but silence is its own sentence. No name, no date. Just the ghost of a confession." Jessica turned the paper over. A thin margin of blue ink had seeped into the corner. Familiar. The same ink as the stained message from days earlier. Had someone tried to destroy this before she arrived, or after Theodore's death? She looked closer. Beneath the grate lay the curled fragment of a second page, blackened and illegible. Deliberate. Someone had burned a journal entry, not for heat, for concealment. Jessica took the remaining scrap and folded it gently into her notebook. Her mind ticked steadily. The voices were rising again, through old letters, torn photographs, discarded pawns, and now burned truths. Someone in Ravenhill had lived long under the burden of a silence they could no longer bear. And someone else had decided it should never be heard. Jessica Fletcher closed the grate softly, the fire crackling behind her, and walked on, not just with questions now, but with purpose. Jessica sat at the writing desk in her guest room, the small scrap of charred paper laid carefully beside the photograph she had retrieved earlier. Outside, the wind had quieted, but inside, her thoughts churned steadily. The photograph. 6 writers, youthful and eager, with one corner torn clean away, had begun to take on new significance. Lydia had been among them. Theodore, undoubtedly the host, but the 7th face, the one deliberately removed, lingered like an absence in the room. She glanced again at the ink-stained message and the burned diary scrap. The handwriting, though marred by ash and moisture, bore a rhythm she'd seen before. Tight loops, strong capitals, deliberate strokes. What was the link between the missing face and the silenced voice Theodore had once published, or refused to? The torn edge of the photograph bore a faint ridge. Jessica gently ran her finger along it. Someone had used a letter opener, not torn it by hand. Clean, intentional. And if the diary page had come from the same missing writer? She turned back to her notes, where she'd transcribed the partial phrase, "Silence is its own sentence." The tone was literary but personal. A plea, perhaps. Or an accusation? The pieces were coming together but not yet fitting. Jessica closed her notebook slowly, her gaze falling once more on the hollow edge of the photograph. Theodore hadn't just severed a name from history. He had tried to erase someone from memory. and someone had noticed. Jessica found Camilla that afternoon in the overgrown greenhouse just beyond the back terrace. The glass was smudged from age and rain, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten herbs. Camilla stood at a table of wilted plants, turning a trowel absently in her hand. "May I join you?" Jessica asked gently. Camilla glanced over her shoulder, then shrugged. "I suppose. The plants aren't complaining." Jessica moved closer, her tone light. "Your father once wrote a scathing essay about the decadence of potted flora. He called greenhouses monuments to delusion." Camilla gave a short laugh. Yes, he loathed the ornamental, unless he could control it. Jessica waited, then asked, "Why did you leave for Europe, Camilla?" The trowel stilled. "Because he asked me to. Said it would be better, for the family, for my name, for his reputation." "What had you done?" "Loved the wrong person, spoken the wrong truths. I never even got to pack my journals." Her voice cracked slightly and she turned away. "When I came back, he said the past was behind us. But I found the archives locked, my letters gone. Even my mother's portrait had been stored in the attic." Jessica was quiet a moment. "He erased more than memories." Camilla nodded, eyes still on the soil. "He erased what he couldn't control." Jessica absorbed the words in silence. The erasure wasn't limited to reputations. It was emotional, intimate, strategic, and perhaps, in Camilla's case, not fully forgiven. That evening, Jessica entered the small study adjacent to the library and found Simon seated at the desk, his pen moving across a narrow ledger in precise, measured strokes. He didn't look up when she entered. "Just documenting the household events for legal record," he said. Mr. Hawthorne was clear about order. Jessica moved to the edge of the room, her tone soft. "Simon, I wonder if we could speak honestly for a moment." His pen paused, then resumed. "Honesty is rarely productive after a man's death." "That rather depends on how he died." Simon looked up at last. Jessica continued, "You've served Theodore faithfully for years, but I wonder, was it loyalty or fear?" A flicker crossed his face, barely a twitch, but it was enough. "He gave me purpose," Simon said. "More than anyone ever did. I protected what he built." "Even from the truth?" Simon closed the ledger, fingers resting lightly on the cover. "The truth was inconvenient, often harmful. He believed legacies were earned, not inherited." Jessica studied him. "You don't grieve him." "I respect him." Jessica nodded slowly, sensing what wasn't being said. Respect, in Theodore's world, had been currency, sometimes bartered in silence. Simon's account of the night before had been too smooth, too practiced. And now she felt the polish wasn't devotion, but design. He had protected the legacy. But perhaps, she thought, he had also arranged the aftermath, and in doing so might have concealed far more than grief. Jessica lingered in the library that night, reviewing the fragments once more. Photograph, ink-stained page, the ivory pawn. Each, in its way, spoke of control, and each, she now suspected, had been filtered through Simon Trent's exacting care. Simon's presence in Theodore's life had not been passive. He had curated it, schedules, guests, the household's tempo. Even the will drafted and witnessed bore Simon's signature. She recalled how he had been the first to enter the library after the storm, how swiftly he had concluded suicide, how he had found the scene already arranged, and how quickly he had offered its interpretation. Jessica turned her attention to the chessboard again. The pawn she had replaced was now slightly misaligned. A small thing, but telling. Control invited oversight. Control demanded uniformity. Theodore's public image had been maintained meticulously. No scandals, no messy entanglements. Yet behind that facade had been the disquiet of voices excluded. Camilla, Lydia, the unknown figure torn from the photograph. And who had the most to lose if those stories emerged now? Simon. Not from guilt, but from allegiance. Legacy to him had been sacrosanct. Jessica stood quietly, heart steady, mind sharper than ever. She didn't yet know if Simon had committed murder, but she was increasingly certain he had committed erasure, and that too, in its way, was violence. Jessica found Lydia seated in a faded armchair near the upstairs window, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the warmth of the room. "May I sit?" Jessica asked gently. Lydia gestured vaguely. "If you must." They sat in silence for a moment, the rain ticking softly against the glass. "You're unwell," Jessica said quietly. Lydia sighed. "It's not a secret. But I'm not dying fast enough to excuse me from suspicion, am I?" Jessica remained still. "You were named in Theodore's will." I was shocked. And suspicious. That man never gave without strategy. "You once loved him." Lydia nodded. "In my youth, before I learned how little that mattered." Jessica paused, then asked, "Did he know you were ill?" "I wrote him a letter. Told him I forgave him, in case I didn't have the chance to say it in person." "And did he reply?" A smile, faint and bitter. "He sent me a check." Jessica watched her carefully. Lydia's anger ran deep, but so did her fatigue. There was sorrow, but no malice in her eyes. And her hands, brittle, delicate, were not the hands of someone who could arrange a body or shatter an inkwell in fury. But even the frail, Jessica knew, could carry secrets. Still, what she sensed most now was resignation, the kind that comes not from guilt, but from knowing the truth has outlived its usefulness, and perhaps its audience. Later that night, Jessica wrote quietly in her notebook, her handwriting neat and restrained, as though the act itself demanded decorum. Her thoughts returned to Lydia. Not the fragile woman before her now, but the younger Lydia in the photograph, alive with purpose, barely restrained fire in her eyes. What had Theodore taken from her? Not only a book, perhaps, but a voice, a future, a sense of identity. Jessica had seen it before, the damage that lingered when truth was dismissed and genius suppressed. But Lydia, for all her anger, didn't seem capable of murder, not anymore. There was still a dignity in her, weathered but intact. And there was something else, too. In her silence, Lydia had become a mirror, one that reflected not motive, but consequence. Jessica tapped her pen gently. Miles had come to Ravenhill with something to prove. Camilla with something to reclaim. Simon with something to protect. But Lydia had only come to say goodbye. Her presence, in the end, may have been incidental, or it may have been the final push someone else needed, to act, to silence, to bury. Jessica closed the notebook softly. Murder didn't always come from hate. Sometimes it came from sorrow so long suppressed it turned to action, and someone in this house, someone still walking its darkened corridors, had let their pain become a plan. By morning, the rain had thinned to mist, though the roads remained flooded and the house still felt sealed from the outside world. Jessica suggested a memorial for Theodore, nothing formal, just a few words in the library, a room now less haunted by silence than by implication. Simon agreed, though reluctantly. He arranged chairs in a semicircle and insisted on lighting every lamp, as if illumination could fend off tension. Jessica stood beside the hearth, her hands folded, watching as the others gathered. Camilla remained apart, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Miles sat forward, tense, elbows on knees. Lydia, pale, said nothing. Edwin, ever brusque, appeared to be enduring the moment more than honouring it. "I thought we might share reflections," Jessica offered gently. "What Theodore meant, what he left behind." A long pause followed. Then Camilla spoke first. "He left behind silence. For some of us, that's all we were allowed." Edwin scoffed. "He built a house of words. He was a difficult man, brilliant, ruthless, and always 3 moves ahead." Jessica noted Miles's hand, curl into a loose fist. Sometimes he didn't write the words he published, Miles muttered. Simon stiffened. That's not only inaccurate, it's slander. But Jessica didn't intervene. She watched instead. This wasn't a memorial for Theodore. It was a litmus test for grief, for guilt. And in the swirl of unresolved emotion, she could almost hear the truth begin to stir. The tension snapped when Miles rose abruptly, his voice low but carrying. You want to talk about legacy, about brilliance? He didn't even write half the stories he claimed. Simon turned to him, voice sharp. You're out of line. No, Miles said, trembling with restraint. He was out of line when he stole a manuscript that wasn't his and buried it under his name. You all knew. Lydia's eyes widened slightly. Camilla looked away. Jessica, ever still, leaned forward. Which manuscript? She asked softly. Miles inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. My first novel, a labour of 4 years. He praised it, promised to champion it, and then told me it was unpublishable. Jessica tilted her head. And 6 months later I found echoes of it in an unfinished piece he claimed to have discovered from a forgotten writer. Slightly reworded, repackaged. But it was mine. Do you have proof? Edwin asked, sneering. Miles met his gaze. I kept the original draft. Every note, every letter. Jessica felt something click into place. A silenced voice, a buried truth, not from years ago, but from the present. What was the writer's name he attributed it to? She asked. Miles hesitated. Edgar Vale. Jessica blinked. Vale. Lydia's name, but not her identity. Her brother, perhaps? The missing face in the torn photograph? She said nothing aloud, but her mind sharpened. This wasn't just about stolen work. It was about someone Theodore had erased so thoroughly that even his name had become camouflage. Jessica returned to the library once the others had drifted off in silence or disgust. The earlier scratch marks on the floorboard beneath the bookshelf tugged at her mind. This time she came armed with thin gloves and quiet resolve. She pressed again at the side panel. The shelf creaked open farther than before, revealing a narrow recess. Tucked inside, wrapped in cloth, was a worn leather folio, dusty but not untouched. She brought it to the desk and carefully unfolded it. Inside were a collection of typed pages dated over 20 years, all bearing the same distinctive signature. E.V., she read through the titles. The Garden Beyond Sleep, The Glass Hour, Ashes Under Salt. Each one unfamiliar to the public, yet expertly written. The voice was distinct, lyrical, and painfully good. Jessica's heart quickened. These weren't Theodore's words. These were the works of Edgar Vale, and not just stolen, hidden. Some bore marginalia in a different hand. Theodore's, perhaps, changing phrases, removing references, rewriting emotion. Jessica reached the last manuscript, Winter's Pact. The same title Miles had once mentioned during their hallway conversation the previous morning, the novel he had been forced to bury. At the bottom of the stack was a letter, half-burned, signed only with a single phrase. You taught me to write, then taught me to vanish. But I am still here, even if you must pretend I wasn't. Jessica closed the folder slowly. This wasn't just theft. It was literary erasure by a man who could not create, only curate what he could claim. Jessica sat with the photograph again, laying it beside the folio now open on her lap. The seventh face, the one torn away, was no longer a mystery. Edgar Vale, Lydia's brother, or perhaps cousin, or even a close companion under a different name. The connection was real. Jessica could feel it in the structure of the sentences, the resonance of shared grief. She found Lydia in the garden alcove, wrapped in a shawl against the chill, though the sky had begun to clear. "Tell me about Edgar," Jessica said quietly. Lydia didn't flinch. She closed her eyes. He was my brother, 5 years younger, brilliant, shy. He submitted his first story under a pseudonym because he feared no one would read him otherwise. Jessica said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. Theodore promised to mentor him, and for a time he did. But Edgar disappeared one winter, after Theodore published one of his short stories under his own name. Jessica felt a chill not from the breeze. Disappeared? Vanished. We never found a body. But I found his journals, hidden in our old house. He wrote of betrayal, of shame, and of a vow to walk away from literature entirely. Jessica's voice was soft. But his stories remained. Lydia nodded. Theodore kept them, changed them, claimed them. Jessica closed her hand gently over Lydia's. The face had been torn from the photograph, but the voice, buried, bruised, had endured. And now, piece by piece, it had returned to speak. It was well after dusk when Jessica found Miles sitting in the library, staring into the embers with the quiet solemnity of someone already expecting to be found. She took the chair opposite him and placed the leather folio gently on the table between them. He looked down at it and nodded, as if he had known all along that she would find it. "You knew what was behind that shelf," she said softly. Miles didn't answer right away. "I came back the night he died. I'd found Edgar's name on an old registry, one of Theodore's early correspondence logs. And something clicked. I remembered a phrase in one of his supposed early works, word for word from my own draft. He rubbed his eyes. I confronted him, told him I knew what he'd done, to me, to Edgar. He didn't even deny it. He said I should be honored to be part of the machine." Jessica's voice barely rose above a whisper. "So you wrote a new ending?" He nodded slowly. "I didn't plan it. But when I found the pills, the whiskey, the blank page, you staged the suicide. I didn't poison him, but I gave him the pills when he asked for something to sleep. Then I left, came back later, found him still, cold, I think he knew that I knew." Jessica studied him. "Why the arrangement?" "Because otherwise people would praise him, reprint his lies, call him a genius." He looked up. "I just wanted people to ask questions, the kind you ask." Jessica didn't speak. The fire whispered. And in it she heard not confession but exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying silence too long. Jessica remained seated across from Miles, the last of the fire curling into ash. The silence between them held the weight of something irreparable, more than guilt, less than absolution. He looked down at his hands. "I didn't want to kill him, Jessica. I wanted to confront him. I needed to. But by the time I returned," Jessica's voice was low, "he had already taken the pills." Miles nodded slowly. "He wasn't drunk, not really. Just resigned. He said something about endings, that he'd decided to write one of his own. And you let the scene tell a different story?" "I had to. If I'd done nothing, he would have died a martyr, an icon, and Edgar's name would have stayed buried, along with mine." Jessica studied him for a moment. "You rearranged the scene to look like suicide, but also like surrender. You knew it would raise questions." Miles looked at her, eyes tired. "Questions you would ask." Jessica's heart ached, not from outrage, but from recognition. She had seen this before, not the act itself, but the deep sorrow that could make even a gentle person distort justice to make truth heard. "You knew about the manuscripts?" "I read them when I found the compartment weeks ago." He had them all, Edgar's, mine, even Lydia's. Some with red lines through the names. It wasn't theft, it was burial. Jessica said nothing more, not yet. The fire popped faintly, the only interruption in the quiet confession. There would be consequences. But before the world passed judgment, she would ensure that the story, all of it, was finally told. Jessica remained in the library after Miles had gone, her hand resting on the worn leather folio. The final chapters of the truth had been unearthed, but they were far from finished. This wasn't just about revealing a crime, it was about correcting a history. She opened the folder again, her eyes scanning the list of titles Theodore had once claimed as his own. There were notes in the margins, edits scribbled in a heavy hand, but beneath the ink lay voices that had been silenced by power, not merit. She spent the better part of the next hour carefully sorting the pages, one pile for Edgar Vale's work, another for Lydia's unpublished poems, a third for Miles's early drafts. The manuscripts were distinct in tone, but united in one thing. They had all been denied light. Simon appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. "The authorities will be here soon." Jessica looked up. "Then we should be ready to tell them everything, not just what happened last night, but what happened long before." Simon hesitated. "You'll expose him?" "No," Jessica said softly. "I'll expose what he covered up." Simon exhaled, perhaps in relief, perhaps in defeat. "These were never his to begin with," Jessica added, "but the world deserves to read them, and their names deserve to be remembered." He nodded just once and left. Jessica turned back to the manuscripts. This was how justice was written, not in headlines, but in names restored to pages. It was late morning by the time Jessica found Camilla in the drawing room, quietly dusting a row of framed photographs on the mantel, each one of her father at various stages of literary acclaim. She moved with care, though her expression had changed. It was no longer guarded, but contemplative. "He kept their work," Camilla said without turning. "Edgar's, Lydia's, all of it." "Why?" Jessica stepped in. "Because he knew what he was doing, and perhaps deep down he hoped someone would find them one day." Camilla placed the last photograph face down. "Or maybe he just couldn't destroy them. That would have made the theft final." Jessica studied her. "You don't have to protect his image anymore." "I'm not trying to," Camilla said. "I'm trying to decide what comes next." Jessica nodded. "What comes next can be yours to define." Camilla looked over. "The manor's in my name now, the archives, the estate, the contracts. I thought I'd sell it. Leave it all behind, but—" Jessica waited. "I think I want to open it. Not as a museum, as a retreat. For writers who've been silenced, discarded, the ones no one reads anymore." Jessica's heart stirred. "That would be a beginning," she said. Camilla gave a faint smile. "It won't undo the harm." "No," Jessica agreed. "But it will honor those he silenced and perhaps offer something better than forgiveness." It was not a grand gesture, but it was the quiet kind of justice Ravenhill had never known, until now. By early afternoon the mist had lifted, revealing a landscape made cleaner by the storm. A police car arrived at the front drive, its wheels crunching over gravel, now visible beneath fallen leaves. Miles stood waiting by the library window, already dressed, a small suitcase at his feet. Jessica stood beside him. "They'll want your statement," she said gently. "I'll give it," he replied. "All of it. I don't expect leniency." "You may not get it," Jessica agreed, "but truth has its own weight. Lighter, once spoken." He offered a tired smile. "Thank you for listening." Jessica hesitated, then reached into her satchel and handed him a small envelope. Inside were several typewritten pages. "They're Edgar's," she said. "One of the unpublished essays. I thought you might want his voice with you." Miles opened it slowly. The first line read, "Some names are forgotten, some are erased, but voices can echo long after silence." He closed it, eyes glassed. Jessica watched as he stepped out onto the stone steps, where the officers greeted him with quiet civility. No handcuffs, just formality. He turned once before entering the car, his words carried even through the soft autumn air. "He took everything from us. I just wanted to give it back." Jessica nodded. The door closed, the car pulled away. And as Ravenhill stood quiet again, emptied now of its patriarch, Jessica felt no triumph. Only a kind of release. The storm had passed, but its echo echoed with truth. The ferry rocked gently beneath Jessica's feet, the ocean spreading out in glimmering grey beyond the rail. It was a familiar rhythm, Cabot Cove's rhythm, and as she stepped off the dock and walked up the short slope toward home, The salt air felt less heavy than it had in Ravenhill. Still it clung to her coat, just faintly, as if memory could travel like mist. She returned to her cottage as the tide began to retreat, the kettle already filled, the typewriter waiting by the window like an old companion. She moved through her morning with practiced ease, mail, tea, a note to the grocer, but her mind, as always, wandered. She hadn't slept much since leaving Ravenhill. Sleep had never come easily after cases that lived more in grief than in greed. There had been no joy in unravelling the story of Theodore Hawthorne, only necessity. She sat down by the desk, pulled open her notebook, and laid a fresh page beneath her pen. Outside, gulls called and fog touched the trees. Inside, Jessica Fletcher began to write, not about murder or even justice, but about voices, not the kind that shout, the kind that go unheard until someone listens carefully enough. And though Cabot Cove was quiet now, its peace only deepened the contrast with Ravenhill's storm-shadowed silence. Not all noise was loud, and not all silence was empty. Jessica's pen moved slowly across the page. There was no rush. The story had already ended, or at least the visible part. What remained was reflection, a kind of moral housekeeping that she had learned to respect more than closure. She thought of Miles, his resignation not to punishment, but to truth. Not many would call what he did justifiable, and perhaps it wasn't. But she couldn't ignore the layers, the ache of being silenced, the slow corrosion of idealism. Was that justice, or a different kind of tragedy? She sipped her tea and turned the page. Then there was Lydia, fading in every sense of the word. She had not killed, but had been quietly dying under the weight of someone else's voice drowning her own. Jessica couldn't help but wonder if that kind of theft wasn't the cruelest of all, the kind that took from the soul, not the bank. Theodore's legacy would remain complicated, no doubt. History had a habit of simplifying monsters and saints, but Ravenhill had reminded Jessica that the real stories were never tidy. They were bruised at the edges, and often they lived longer in shadows than on shelves. In the end, it wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about what endured and who had the courage to carry it. Sometimes that weight was a manuscript. Other times it was simply memory. Later that afternoon, Jessica retrieved the photograph from her desk drawer, the one she'd carefully repaired with archival tape after returning from Ravenhill. The torn corner had been restored, the face returned. Edgar Vale. She studied him now, the once absent seventh figure. His smile was shy, his posture a touch uncertain, but there was something luminous in his eyes, a hunger, a promise. He had not been famous, not in life, not in death. But now, thanks to truth brought back into the light, his stories would live again. And perhaps that was the greater immortality. Jessica placed the photograph in a slim frame and set it on her bookshelf, between Lydia Vale's first volume of poetry and a new galley-proof she'd just received from a small press in Vermont. Winter's Pact by Edgar Vale, edited by Jessica Fletcher. It wasn't much, but it was something. She turned back to the window where the trees had begun to turn, amber, rust. A touch of fire along the edges. History, she realized, was always written in layers, the polished version, the whispered version, and the one waiting beneath them both, quietly refusing to be erased. And when pieced together, word by word, name by name, it formed not a picture of perfection, but one of truth. It was enough. Sometimes it had to be. Jessica wrote her final thoughts in the wide-margined notebook she reserved only for the most private reflections, never published, never shared, just ink and contemplation. She wrote of Ravenhill not as a place but as a memory, a house where art had been built on silence, where ambition had buried empathy, and where legacy had cost more than any of its inheritors ever truly understood. She paused, then added one last thought. Truth, she wrote, does not expire with time, only with silence. She closed the notebook, then lingered for a moment with her hand upon the cover. Her eyes moved to the bookshelf again. She thought of Edgar, whose words had survived oblivion, of Lydia, who had lived long enough to see her brother's name restored, of Camilla, choosing to turn an inherited wound into a sanctuary for others. Not all endings were happy, but some were honest, and that, Jessica believed, was its own kind of justice. She returned the pen to its holder and rose, the light casting long shadows across the floor as the sun began its descent. Outside, Cabot Cove stirred with its quiet rituals. Inside, Jessica Fletcher allowed herself a rare smile. The story was not hers, but its ending, in the smallest way, had been shaped by her hand, and that, more than punishment, more than praise, was enough. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with thunder. It lingers like fog, waiting for someone brave enough to see through it. But I still wonder, was it justice that found its way into the halls of Ravenhill, or merely the echo of a story rewritten too late? What do you think? Was the ending inevitable? Or could it have been different? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd truly love to read them. And if this story stirred something in you, give it a like, share it with someone who loves a good mystery. And subscribe if you'd like to hear the next secret waiting to be uncovered.